Alright, today we're talking about the worst franchise player currently in the NBA. I'm going to give you my top 5, and I'm going to tell you 3 honorable mentions. Now, my first honorable mention is DeMarcus Cousins. The reason I'm giving him an honorable mention and not necessarily in the top 5 worst is because before he was traded to New Orleans, I don't think he really had enough help around him to show if he's an actual franchise player. He had Rudy Gay, he had Darren Collison, but did he ever really have a good enough team around him that you'd say he should have taken that team to the playoffs 100%, they should have won a series, and they should have been a lot better than they were? I'm not necessarily sure if he did have that type of team around him. Now, a lot of people say, no, he's not because of the locker room problems, which that is a legit point. I agree with that. A franchise player is not gonna cause all the problems that he did in the locker room. Bullying guys, just being difficult with his teammates, and getting all the technical fouls he did. So that's why I'm going to put him as my first honorable mention on this list. My second honorable mention goes to LaMarcus Aldridge of the San Antonio Spurs. The reason I'm going to give him the second honorable mention and not put him in the top 5 is because he's not on San Antonio is not necessarily their franchise player. Kawhi is, but LaMarcus is still looked at as a franchise player, and the reason I'm putting him calling him one of the worst franchise players in the league is because on San Antonio he really hasn't shown what he did in Portland and proved that he is a franchise player. He's really struggled with the mid-range. He's been inconsistent. He's had defensive spurts where he plays really good, and offensive spurts where he plays really good, but then he'll go through these down streaks where he plays terrible. And he was supposed to take like the scoring burden off of Kawhi somewhat, and on defense really help, which last year in the regular season, he did play good defense against Draymond Green. We never really got to see him in the playoffs defend Draymond. That would have been really interesting because he seemed to give Draymond problems on the defensive end and on the offensive end. I'm hoping we get to see that in the playoffs this year. That'd be really interesting. But overall, he just hasn't had the impact on San Antonio that a lot of people thought he was going to have when they originally signed him 2 years ago. He was even in trade rumors. Now, San Antonio shut that down right away and said, we're not trading him. They're more of a team that's like, they'll keep working him into the system, changing things for him. But overall, he really has proven not to be that franchise player that you would build a team around. My last honorable mention is going to go to Brook Lopez of the Brooklyn Nets. The reason I'm putting him at number 3 on the honorable mention and not really putting him in the main top 5 is because a lot of people, including me, I don't really think he's a franchise player. I just think in Brooklyn, he's on that big contract. They really screwed themselves over when they made all those trades, and he's the only guy that they have there that you can really feed the ball to on offense and say, he's our guy, he's our go-to guy, which is what they do, and they just put whatever they can around him, and they just feed him the ball on offense. Defensively, pick and roll defense, he's one of the worst big men in the league. He doesn't rebound for how big he is. He should get 10 boards a night. He averages like 6 or 7. I wouldn't call him a franchise player, and I don't think a lot of people would. But since he's in Brooklyn on that terrible Nets team, he's really looked at as the franchise player. And that's why I'm not putting him in the main top 5. I'm just giving him a mention because I wouldn't necessarily call him a franchise player, even though the Nets look at him as one. Although a few years back when he was, I don't know if you'd call him the main piece of that team, but he took that decent Nets team to the playoffs a few years ago, and you could say he was a franchise player then, but overall I'm just not really sure if he is a franchise player in the NBA. But if you want to call him that, then he would definitely be one of the worst franchise players in the league. All right, the number 5 worst franchise player in the NBA, I'm going to go with Paul Millsap. Now remember, I'm not saying Paul Millsap is a terrible NBA player and he's not good. He's a great NBA player. I just don't know about him being your franchise player and the first option on a team. If you look at the Atlanta Hawks, which this year he is really their main guy, with them getting rid of Horford, Korver, Teague, everybody's gone 2 years ago. I'd still call him the best player on that Hawks team that was first in the East. But as you saw, they got demolished by the Cavs in the playoffs. Last year, they got killed by the Cavs in the playoffs. Paul Millsap, I wouldn't call him a better franchise player. I think he's a second or third option. You want him as a second or third option on a contending team. But he's the face of the Hawks franchise, and they're going to the playoffs, and he's a solid player, but when you put him as the face of the franchise, I just don't know if that's necessarily what you want him as. I think if he would have went to a team like Toronto when he was on the trade block and he would have been the third option on their team, then you really would have seen that team improve and he could really show his value. But Paul Millsap as the franchise player in Atlanta and the number one option, I just think that he's one of the weaker franchise players in the league currently. My number 4 worst franchise player in the NBA is going to go to Damian Lillard of the Portland Trail Blazers. And I was very hesitant to put him in the top 5 worst franchise players because I really like Damian. Coming from a small college, he can shoot the ball, he can take it to the hole, his mid-range game is good, he's very emotional, he's into the game, he wants to win, he's an underdog, he's made the All-Star team one time, which is ridiculous. He should be like a 3-time All-Star. He always gets left off. But the reason I'm calling him one of the worst franchise players in the league is because in Portland, you've seen them build around him. And they did they beat Houston a few years ago, went to the second round of the playoffs. Last year, they went to the second round of the playoffs, even though that was because the Clippers, they lost to Chris Paul and Blake Griffin. They took a game where they get 1 or 2 off of Golden State last year, but Curry was hurt, and they're not a contending team to win it. And this year, you're really seeing it with them probably not going to make the playoffs. And Lillard's who they lean on to carry that franchise. There's McCollum, but Lillard is your franchise player there. And I just don't know if you can lean on a small point guard. I don't like to say this, but this is kind of a small point guard that isn't the great defender, especially when you've got another small ball handler beside him in McCollum. It's going to be tough for Lillard to lead that team. And that's why I'm saying he's one of the weaker franchise players in the league, because Lillard would really be served as your second option. You know, if you had an all-around small forward on the team, they went and got Evan Turner, and that was terrible. I could see that coming right from when that happened. But Lillard would really be good if he had an all-around small forward that could do everything, and then he was just kind of relied on to shoot, score, handle the ball, set players up, and then surround those two guys with 3-and-D players, which they put some 3-and-D players around him on Portland. But he doesn't have the firepower alone to really carry that team and take it all the way. He really needs another star player to help him, which is why I wouldn't necessarily call him one of the best franchise players in the league. And I'd call him one of the weaker ones because he does need that help. He's kind of shown that he can't do it by himself. For number 3 on this list, I'm going to go with Kemba Walker of the Charlotte Hornets. And the reason I'm putting him at number 3 is because he's been there 4 or 5 years now. They've made the playoffs one time last year, losing in 7 to the Heat. They've relied on him to be the main scorer, playmaker for that team, and he hasn't been able to take them to all the way to where they really want to go. Kemba, I think he'd be served best as the second or third option on a contender, but he's the face of their franchise. He's a good player, but I don't think he's going to be the best player on a championship team. They've surrounded him with 3-and-D wings in Batum, Kid Gilchrist, even though he can't shoot the 3 at all, Marvin Williams, Marco Bellinelli, even though he can't play defense. So there are some holes. They got Kaminsky coming off the bench. It doesn't help that Zeller clogs the paint and he starts, but they've put a decent team around him, and he's taken them to the playoffs, and they've had some good seasons. He's had some good moments, but overall he's not a franchise player that's going to lead your team to a title, and that's why I'm putting him at number 3 on this list. At number 2, I'm going to put Carmelo Anthony, and the reason a lot of people, they're going to get mad, say it's the team around him, which is very true. His team is awful. The Knicks have not done much to help him other than drafting Porzingis. I mean, that was more about last year's team. This year's team, they did put somewhat of a veteran team around him, getting Rose and Noah, even though Noah's he's not the same player that he was. They got the 3-and-D wing in Courtney Lee. Porzingis really hasn't taken that next step, but he's still a solid player. You got Melo. The bench has really struggled, although Hernando Gomez has shown that he's got potential. Kumiskas, he can hit the 3 off the bench. Lance Thomas is a 2-way wing. Brandon Jennings he's an offensive, he's a scorer, but he doesn't play any defense. So, and this team has just been terrible this year, and that's really it shows you that Melo right now, I'm not saying in the past he definitely was. When he was with Denver, I mean, they went to the playoffs year after year. He was 100% a franchise player. They just weren't able to really get too far in the playoffs. But now, where he is in his career, he's not a franchise player. He's like a lot of these other guys. He would be good as I think he could be a second option on the team, scoring. He would have to play better defense than he does now, but he's just not served as your franchise player. The Knicks they've shown and proved that he's not a franchise player. They've tried to make him the franchise player in New York, and he's really not. I think they would be best served if Porzingis would really take that next step next year and be the superstar on the team, and then Melo could sit back and be the scorer and the leader on the team, and that would really serve them better than right now, where they're trying to make Melo the franchise player. And number 1 on this list, the worst franchise player in the NBA, goes to Andre Drummond of the Detroit Pistons. The reason I'm giving him the label of the worst franchise player in the NBA is because he's got all the tools to be a franchise player. They've built the team around him in Detroit, putting 3-and-D wings around him and Morris, Contavious Caldwell-Pope, Reggie Jackson's a good defender. Tobias Harris isn't a great defender, but he plays offense. They've got Stanley Johnson off the bench. They built that team around him and him run the pick and roll with Reggie, and he has all the tools to be great defensively, and he hasn't made any more strides this year. He's made 0 strides. Last year he was a good defender. This year he's a solid defender, but he's not great. He hasn't got the free throws fixed yet. His post-up game is, if he gets it deep in the post, he's going to score. Every once in a while he'll have a good post-up from the outside, but it's not a great post game, and he has no other offensive. He doesn't contribute any other way on offense, and on defense, he hasn't been the same defender he's been in the past 2 years. He hasn't taken that next step this year, and because of that, you're seeing Detroit really struggle. That's why they're on the outside looking in the playoffs, not sure if they're going to make it. He hasn't been the same player as he was the last 2 years, where the last 2 years they were relying on him to be the main guy running the offense through him and Jackson. He was the number 1 guy on defense. You go in the paint and he would block that. This year he's not the same player, and that's why Detroit's struggling, and he was available at the deadline, him and Jackson, and that's why he's the worst franchise player in the league, is because I don't think he's a franchise player anymore. And with that's going to wrap up my video on the worst franchise player in the NBA. I want you guys to remember, these guys aren't at all terrible players. They're all still really good players in the NBA. They're just not necessary. They're players that have franchises built around them that you wouldn't, in a perfect world, want to build a franchise around. So I'm not saying they're bad players at all. Most of these guys I'd love to have on my team. They're just not who I would build my team around. So with that, thank you guys for watching. Have a good day.